Hi there, everybody. I'm Dan Tratensek from the North American Hardware and Paint Association, and I am here today with Dan Starr, the other Dan, Dan Starr. Well, maybe I'm the other Dan.
No, I'm the other Dan. On this show, I'm the other Dan.
With Dan Starr from Do It Best Corp, and we got a lot to talk about today. Yeah. But at first, I wanted to welcome everybody to the NHPA, NRHA All Industry Conference. I know that's kind of weird to say, and we're kind of at a point in time. But for those of you who don't know, the North American Retail Hardware Association is now the North American Hardware and Paint. It's even hard to come out. North American Hardware and Paint Association, as we have welcomed paint and decor dealers into our membership. So welcome to our All Industry Conference, and welcome to everybody who is attending the National Hardware Show in a virtual sense. Dan, we had planned on getting together face-to-face. It was a few months ago now, but some things kind of threw a wrench into that for us. But here we are in Fort Wayne at Do It Best's headquarters, still getting to kind of talk about this concept of disruptors. So welcome, and thank you for being so flexible in making this happen.
We're really hard to walk right down the hall and do this. But I count it as a privilege, Dan, not only because you've got me speaking as part of the conference, but it's also because our plans were disrupted. We had a chance to do this a couple different times.
Yeah, I know.
And so I've benefited from doing this multiple times now, more than I planned. I hope your audience appreciates all that airtime, but we'll see.
Like I said, when I got here, it feels like I'm up here for my monthly interview.
How about that?
with you. Well, let me start with a question before we get into this concept of disruptors. And it's it's interesting that we were disrupted on our way to disruption and talking about disruption. But before we get into that, I wanted to ask you just kind of a blanket question. Is now a good time to be an independent retailer in this industry? I mean, certainly positives, but there's also some challenges.
Yeah, and I know we're going to touch on some things that are either perceived issues or some challenges that we've confronted here lately. But I love this question because I'm more convinced now than ever that this is the best time. And maybe I sound wildly optimistic, but I don't think so. I think this is the best time to get into this industry and independence in particular. And I'll give you a couple prejudiced reasons why, and then I'll try to give you a couple reasons that I think are more grounded in data I can suggest to you. So start with the biases. I think this is a great industry. So no surprise, I'm in this industry. I find it to be a great industry, great people. And so, yes, I think it's great to join that industry. But I also am biased in that I think that Do It Best is a great partner to welcome into this industry. So leave those biases aside. You would expect me,
absolutely,
right, to carry those biases with me.
If you said different, it'd be surprising.
It would be news. But then I go beyond that, and I'll point to a couple things that I think, from a timing standpoint, actually do us a great favor in terms of where are we relative to our history, and why is this a good time? Why is this a good moment in time in the history of our industry that, it makes sense to join this? Let's look at housing first. I don't know what your market is like. Yeah. I can tell you markets all across this country are going through, and that started pre-pandemic. There was strength in that housing market, which we rely upon. In this industry, a new customer could be thought of as either somebody coming into the store, or a new house on the market, or a house that just got sold. Either way, you could look at that as a potential customer source. Housing in this country is just kind of out of control. Started pre-pandemic, and it's gotten more and more strong as we've gone along. And that's both in terms of numbers, which you go out and look at the news, people say things not since 2006. Now, those are scary words to use, but not since 2006. In terms of numbers, in terms of pricing pressure, those are all things that lead people to do more. More projects, more flipping, more investment. Right. It is a good time from just a housing standpoint. I'll look at then DIYers. Now, you and I might have sat here about a year ago and said, we're awfully concerned about consumers, especially the younger consumer. Right. Where are all the DIYers? Turns out all we needed was a global pandemic to reveal how many there are out there. Yeah, and it's a great time for them. What with YouTube videos, vendor videos, there's access to information to help them along in any kind of DIY project, Pinterest or anything else. So there's greater strength in DIY than we would have said even a year ago. The numbers are good. You want to feel old for a second?
I already do. Yeah.
Let me help you. Let me help you feel even older. Millennials. We've talked about that generation a lot. I looked this up just so I could give you the right numbers on this. That age group right now ranges from 24 to 39 years of age. They're 39.
That's amazing. Yeah.
You're
they're not the new kids on the
They're
block.
not the new kids on the block.
Not the actual new kids on the block, but
yeah, and
theoretically.
And that group is bigger than the boomers.
Yeah.
So you've got a surge in population kind of coming into home and home ownership, and I think part of that DIY class. And then I would just say one final sort of temporary situation, and that is the generational change. I do think that we're going through a succession planning, not crisis, but a huge turn, right?
Yeah.
In succession. And so there's tons of opportunity for growth. So I just think you stack all that up, the economy and all the other pressure points, the demographics, just the way things are aligned right now. And I think we're at a point for not just growth through the pandemic, but going beyond that. I think there's almost 10 years of growth ahead of us.
Well, it's amazing how some of those concerns pre-pandemic, and given all of the challenges that the market has seen in terms of employment and things like that. At the same time, you've got record low interest rates. Housing prices are strong, but they're not really pricing too many out of the market. So I think you are seeing a lot of in my own household, millennial and Gen Z, my daughter and son-in-law bought a house back in May. So that concept that, millennials don't want to buy houses anymore, or millennials are and younger aren't going to be DIYers, like you said, that myth has really kind of evaporated.
Yeah, we're challenging that notion, and I think in the best of all ways. I mean, I've got a child who's on the cusp of that too, and I don't want him in my basement. He doesn't want to be in my basement.
Yeah.
And not that one story is all of it, but we can quickly relate to that. We can get our arms around that and just say, no, I think they're challenging that notion that they're averse somehow to home ownership. I guess I just don't see that.
Yeah, no, and I think it's the ability to get one, and the affordability and interest rates certainly help with that.
Absolutely.
So that's disruptor number one that we've talked about.
Yes, good.
For those of you
Tick
keeping
that off.
score out there, that's disruptor number one.
Exactly.
But I think before we go into just talking about this concept of industry disruption from a non-pandemic standpoint, I think we've got to address the disruptor, at least for 2020. And I was giving a webinar not too long ago and quoting someone else in the industry, an analyst, who said this could very well be the biggest disruptor to the home improvement industry that we have seen in our lifetimes, and to retail and the way consumers shop.
Yeah.
So what do you think, in your crystal ball, what are some of the lingering, you and I talked not too long ago on our podcast just about everything that's going on right now as it surrounds it, but what do you think are some of the lingering things that are going to stick with it, those sticky things, if you will, from the pandemic that are going to continue to disrupt?
Yeah, and I'll give you three.
Okay.
I'll give you three, and I think you can measure them out by how long they linger.
Yeah.
Their stickiness in that regard. One is just exhaustion. Another is supply chain. The last one I'll mention is workplace environment. Okay. Because I think they all have differing size of their tail. Right now, exhaustion, I would just point to our members and their teams. They've been living under the yoke of increased demand now for over 6 months, and there just hasn't been much of a break.
Yeah.
And so the cumulative effect of that is getting very, very tough. And so it's going to linger. They need a break because our sales aren't letting up. Mm-hmm. I still look at that and I go, regardless of where it's coming from, the hardline side, lumber, building material, we're still seeing sales increases year over year that range from 25 to 35% given on a different day.
Right.
That's huge. Our members are going through that exact same thing, and their teams haven't had a break. Oh, and by the way, there's wildfires, there's floods, there's hurricanes, there's all the other stuff that can affect you in your localized area. But on top of that, singular urgent response that's in the environment, you've got this broader issue of the pandemic that still hasn't gone away yet.
Right.
So I think we're dealing with exhaustion as one. That next one, supply chain, it's going to be with us for a while. And again, I could point to across the entirety, the breadth of home improvement. You've got manufacturers whose safety stocks are depleted, who've run through so much product. And it's not just that they went through a spike in demand, it's a sustained spike in demand. So even though some may be caught up to pre-pandemic manufacture, their output is higher than it was before, or they got back to it, or they got even higher. They're still digging out of a bit of a hole and dealing with demand that greatly exceeds that. So down to the raw material, I look at that and go, whether you're talking about things that go into manufacturing processes or raw material in the sense of dimensional lumber, there are shortages that are affecting supply, and I don't believe we're going to get out of it anytime soon.
It'll take a while to catch up. Yeah, right.
So you've got that lingering for a while. It's going to be a while, I think. And then lastly, this issue of workplace. I know for our members, that may not be a significant issue. But there's a residual impact on them. I think when I look at Do It Best, when I look at a lot of our vendors, they're struggling with that workforce issue and how they manage that in the right way. Before we started the podcast, I was just sharing with you that, I'm a big believer in culture. And I think one of the things that's made Do It Best so successful is the unique and strength of the culture that exists here. And part of it is the calling that we feel to serve our members. That culture of service is huge around here, and it helps define how we engage with our membership. Frankly, I think it'd be very difficult to replicate that in a remote workforce environment. And so we've been fortunate, at least in the state of Indiana, the impact of COVID has not been as significant as in other places. And so we followed CDC recommendations, we followed the governor's orders, still able to bring people back in a distanced and higher cleaning schedules and all those kinds of things, but adaptive environment. But we brought everybody physically back middle of June, a little early. But knock on whatever this aluminum.
It's aluminum, I think.
Yeah. We've not had cases diagnosed that originated here. We've had a couple positive cases. They've acquired it elsewhere. We've managed it pretty well. Yeah. And I want to continue to do that because to me, that workforce issue, it's an important one.
Well, it's interesting because I think the three things you touched on aren't necessarily the first three that I think come to mind for people, but in my discussions, certainly with the retailers we talk to, I hear exactly what you're saying. I hear retailers telling me, I am worried about my people right now because they've been pulling extra shifts. There's just the mental concern. I mean, I know, I don't know how it is for you, but for me, when you have to go in and you're wearing a mask, just even in a store for an hour or so, it's oppressive, but these guys are doing it 8-10 hours a day. So all those things I do hear from retailers, I'm starting to become concerned about literally not being hyperbolic about this, but PTSD like symptoms, coming from our workers that have been working their butts off in this essential capacity. And so that is definitely something. And obviously we all hear, I'd imagine you hear about supply chain a little bit, but I hear about that as well.
We've heard a little bit about it. So yeah, you've got that inside the store for some of our members where that's affecting them directly. But guess what? They're being asked to perform their role, and people are still coming through the door who are similarly affected. Right. I was in one of our member stores. I actually entered it. You got time for a brief story?
Oh, sure. Yeah, that's what we're here for.
So I go into a member store, and apparently something happened right before I got in there. Now, this is early part of pandemic. This is before masks became mandatory. Right. And this is a local member of ours, Connolly's, and they had already implemented curbside service. They'd already responded and done a bunch of things for anybody concerned with COVID. Somebody had come into the store, and this person was so incensed that the young gal behind the counter was not wearing a mask. Again, it wasn't mandatory at the time. Right. Most stores didn't even have them. This guy went completely ballistic. He berated this young gal and just let her have it for about apparently 5 minutes and stormed out the door. That's right about when I came in. This poor gal was just reduced to tears. And I know for a fact that kind of experience is not an isolated one.
No.
People have been unkind
Yeah.
in a retail environment.
To a level that not anybody's used to. I mean, because the
That's right.
the venom around whether you're wearing a mask or not wearing a mask isn't like I'm upset because this product didn't do what I wanted it to. It's really a different.
It's ramped up.
It's not something that I would think anybody would expect a retail employee to have to deal with in the course of their job.
Exactly so. And so I was. It was just. It bothers you.
Yeah.
And I know that I've talked to other members who have fielded stuff in the store, or, they get anonymous feedback coming at them, social media or email or what have you, or calls, with people just amped up.
Yeah.
And so there's a weight and a cumulative effect of that too. It wears on people.
Yeah, absolutely. And like I said, those are things that it's going to take us a while to work through all of that. So I'm glad you pointed those things out. But we had talked about this. The primary intent of our discussion today was not COVID related, but like I said, I don't know that you could discuss disruptors without at least starting with COVID. So let's make a shift.
I guarantee we're going to talk about it again at some point.
It might come up. It might come up at some point here.
Yeah.
But for the meantime, let's make a little shift away from COVID and just talk about this concept of disruption. And we've said disruption could be a good thing, it could be a bad thing. But most of the time, when we talk about disruption at retail, everybody, you read the Wall Street Journal and all the other publications out there, and they like to talk about these things, what companies are disrupting. But you always hear about Amazon, or you hear about Home Depot, or you hear about something like that. Rarely do you hear about how are these small independent retailers, and I say small, and I'm saying small in comparison to Amazon, which would be everybody else, I guess, but these smaller independently owned retailers, they're disrupting too, aren't they? I mean, and what do you see what do you see kind of in that area? Can independent retailers be disruptors if they can't shake the industry as a whole?
Yeah, and that's the good distinction to have.
Yeah.
Can they be disruptors? Usually, I think you do think of disruption as something in terms of its aggregate impact, that it moves the needle for an entire industry. Independents, by definition, are a little bit different. You got to define the market down, and in that environment, can they? Absolutely. And so, who does that? I think in many ways, I know you want to get off the subject, but it's been difficult. The last 6 months are not the best time to evaluate how they've been disruptors. Sure. Frankly, they've been inundated with demand in their stores. So they haven't had a requirement to disrupt. They've had a requirement to serve effectively their communities. And they've done a phenomenal job of that, even as they adjusted things, right, to be able to continue to do that in the right way after being declared essential. Beyond that, I think the key things that you tend to look at in our industry are those independents who define themselves. So you've got a lot of folks, and I'm generalizing, but you've got a lot of folks who might define, we've got a breadth of core departments that we're going to have.
I'm a hardware store. That's my definition.
Right.
Yeah, right.
But then they tend to define themselves by a niche or by a specialization of what they do. And usually it's more than one, right? So they're going to define themselves by work clothing, and they're going to define themselves by, there's some great members who have like a gift area that they're really, really strong in. We've got members who absolutely kill it when it comes to grilling and grilling accessories, and then they go beyond that into creating rubs and spices and barbecue sauces, and so it's like the go-to place, and they change up their product mix. I think those are the ones that I tend to think of from a disruption. The way that they serve is important too, but I think the primary thing that comes to my mind is in the product offerings or the identity that they create within their community, and then they become the go-to place for that item within their communities. And that's regardless of there's a big box store 2 miles down the road. They can still do that.
And so it's really about, for the independents, about being that disruptor within your trade area, because quite honestly, you're not really concerned about being a disruptor in Boca Raton, Florida, if you're in Ames, Iowa.
Exactly.
So,
Exactly
okay.
right. Exactly right.
Yeah, one thing I will have to say is that I really do think, though, that even during the pandemic, some of our research that we did a couple months back showed that at the time, the people who had responded to our study, 72% of the independent retailers had already implemented curbside pickup,
Yeah.
which to me was just amazing that these independent retailers were so quick to be able to adapt their operations to say, oh, we got to do this. And they flip a switch and they do that. Because normally, independent retailers aren't quite that quick to move in a direction like that. But
that's exactly right. So it's reactive. Even so, I think that's exactly right. Whether it's the sort of, well, let's contrast that. You've got a decentralized operation where ownership is localized, entrepreneurship is there, ownership and decision making is concentrated right there at the ground level. That is everything you need to facilitate that kind of quick adaptive response to serve their community, and they just proved it. Yeah. They absolutely demonstrated what they are capable of in that environment, and the numbers back it up.
Right. So independent retailers, we both agree, and that's the most important thing.
Exactly.
We both agree. Independent retailers can certainly be disruptors, but as we're trying to maybe further define that for our audience in terms of when you think of kind of retail disruptors, can you give any kind of examples of operations inside the industry, outside the industry, independent, chain that you think are kind of good models of companies that are actively acting as disruptors?
Yeah, frankly, it was easier for me. And a quick disclaimer, Dan was kind enough to share a few of these questions with me in advance so I could think about it. So this is not right off the cuff.
After this, they all change though, Dan. So
after this, it's all different. But this one required a little bit of thought because frankly, I did think about our industry, and there's one I'll get to at the tail end. In response to this, because I think it has that feature to it, and it will impact our industry. But I started thinking of others that are a little outside of our industry that are recent. And I'm not commenting on whether they're good or bad. I'm just saying they've been disruptive.
Well, and disruption, like we said, can be good or bad. It's just something that's making a point and change.
Yeah. And so I started thinking about that, and I started thinking, okay, we've actually seen a lot in the last year or so. One that caught my attention was the whole notion. Have you heard the terminology "bed in a box"?
Yes.
You have heard that.
Yes.
That didn't exist just a year or two ago.
Yeah.
It's the idea that a manufacturer of a mattress won't have a retail storefront. They're going to ship it directly, and you open it up, and suddenly there's all these different manufacturers of beds that are shipping to you.
Well, and of all the things that if you're sitting around with someone making that pitch to you saying, I want to build a business where I'm shipping mattresses, you'd say that's
the dumbest idea.
If there's one thing you don't want to ship, it's a mattress.
Right. You would think that. Another one, just in terms of the sheer creation of market size, again, I'm not saying it's good, but CBD product. Mm-hmm. I'm not the expert in their medical utility. You know what I mean?
Sure, yeah.
You can't deny the fact that there is a disruptive impact, and the market share and the sales is crazy.
Well, and you think how quickly it went from fringe kind of appeal to now you're in the line at Kroger and they've got CBD product in the checkout. I mean, yeah.
I still don't really know what they do. I'm not sure I want to know what they do.
Yeah, or their efficacy or what, but you're absolutely
the sales are in
right
billions.
To think about it. And it was in maybe a 2-year period that it went from nobody knows what it is. Maybe it's a TV channel, but now everybody at least knows what it is, and it's pretty commonplace.
Yes, exactly right. A couple others. Quick food service. That's another one I was thinking
definitely.
of. Has changed dramatically, has been disruptive. And whether you're going to a convenience store, Chick-fil-A, or a higher end of quick food service, it is amazing how much volume has been driven in that direction. Then the last one I'll mention is transportation network companies. So think of this in terms of the Uberization of America, right? So it started with that kind of thing, where you've got a transportation network that whether you're a user or you're a provider, you can come into that network or that community and pick up the use or the service, right? So I think of that and apply that to our industry. That notion of ride sharing, it exists for us with respect to backhauling.
Okay, yeah.
Okay,
All right,
so
sure.
so this lowers the cost, the delivered cost of product to our members to the extent that we can leverage backhauling opportunities. That's ride sharing.
Right.
The other big one that I look at for the future is the notion of last mile ride sharing for product. There's already a lot of different companies who are claiming that they have the ability and the scale to get to a platform where they'll be able to do this nationwide. I think there's more shakeout that needs to occur, but that could have a huge impact within our industry
Yeah.
for a lot of our members.
Well, I know that even not too long ago, it was either at last year's hardware show or the year before, we had talked to a company that was trying to get something like that started, kind of like a Uber delivery service. If
Yeah.
you bought a swing set at your local retailer and they don't deliver, or you bought a grill and they don't deliver, you could use the app to get them to come. Somebody comes by with a truck, picks it up, and takes it to your house. And so again, I certainly agree with you that this concept is got to have an impact on I guess just about every step of logistics within the channel.
Yeah, and so you can imagine for me, that occupies a lot of interest for me.
Oh, sure.
In terms of do you build it or do you partner, and how do you incorporate that into the offerings that we would want to provide to our membership? Again, there's some shaking out that needs to occur. So the capability is one, but then having the reliable resource nationwide is another. So that's one that I would look at and say, disruption now, yes, but it's going to touch us in a bigger way, I think, in the future.
Well, this whole concept of disruptors, you also have to think about, I'm going to coin a phrase and I'll include it in a book someday, but the cycle of disruption by Dan Tratensek.
Boy, I'd buy that in a heartbeat.
But there's a disruption within an industry, but then there are like a stone thrown into a pond. This is the opening paragraph of the book.
I love it.
Stone thrown into the pond, the ripples that kind of occur from that. There's a disruption that kind of prompts this evolution. And so I want to get to how independent retailers can evolve and are evolving. But I also want to, before we get into that conversation, I want to talk a little bit about this concept of the way independent retailers in this industry specifically are kind of viewed. And I always like to ask people who have more of a 35,000 foot view of the industry at large, what do you think are some of the misconceptions, even within our channel, that still persist about independent retailers in home improvement?
Yeah, it'd be interesting to get your feedback as you ask that question. What are the more common ones? The one that I look at is just the notion of, and there's some truth to it, like every overgeneralization, there's probably a little bit of a truth to it, but bemoaning the lack of young entrepreneurs within our space.
I think that's,
There's a lot of that kind of talk, and I think it does the ones who are really doing a great job a disservice. I think, could you have more? Sure, yeah, you could have more. Is there going to be a succession issue? I've already talked about that. Yes, but there are a ton of great young retailers out there, and I just happen to have a nice little rundown of a few that I.
Do you know a few?
Not an exhaustive list.
Yeah.
But I look at folks like Ryan Ringer in Gold Beach.
Oh, absolutely.
So Ryan, great young entrepreneur, came into the business, wasn't interested in just staying with one store, was looking to grow. He's got 7 locations now. Don't know how the man is able to do what he does, because he is working all the time.
Also one of NHPA's directors on our board of directors.
On your board, yes. And I'm sure he's a great
involved
board
in the industry beyond just his own stores.
Absolutely. I look at Curtis Gilman.
Wow, yeah, absolutely.
Gilman does a great job in terms of not just, boy, they're great operators, but their path of growth. They've made some really impressive acquisitions. Some of them existing operations, a couple greenfields. They are very, very deliberative in how they go about their growth model, and they've had tremendous success in growth. And Curtis is a young guy still. I think he's got a lot of years ahead of him of growth. Matthew Holmes just took over for his dad. You know, John Holmes was on our board for a while, and they had a great succession plan, and Matthew is running that business.
Young Retailer of the Year this year.
How about that? It's like I'm ticking down a list of who's who. Diana Newton.
Diana Newton, absolutely.
Was she a young retailer at one point? She absolutely was. She's now on our
board of directors, right?
She's got 2 convenience hardware locations in Southern California, adding a third. So a great retailer. And I look at Samantha and Scott Post, brother-sister duo. Tim Post, their dad is on our board, but they are really running operations. They're doing a fantastic job. I can keep on going.
Right.
I don't want to slight anybody by leaving them off this list. We've got a lot of really dynamic young retailers who are doing a phenomenal job. So that's the one I would pick out. I don't know if there's another one that you would look at.
No,
and
I
say,
think that's a little bit more. I mean, there's always the general overall blanket of, the kind of duality of the term mom and pop, because I mean, on one hand, it's true. These are family businesses.
Yeah.
95% of the businesses in our industry are family businesses. So, and it's not necessarily a derogatory term, mom and pop. But I think sometimes the way it's used is, they're doing business out of a cigar box, all these independent retailers. And as you and I well know, I think I've seen more sophisticated ideas and principles and practices. They're just market kind of specific or market focused in a lot of those areas. So they're not receiving the hype. But certainly, I would hazard to say more out of the independent segment than I see out of the big boxes in this industry, because there's so many of them. So many of them making these little changes. So to toss that kind of blanket, they're not sophisticated, they're running dusty stores, they don't, that's certainly, I mean, not the case. And I know you guys have examples in that area too of highly sophisticated operations.
We do.
Yeah. So
and that's why it's a great thing to profile them. I think it's wonderful that you continue to do what you've done in terms of the young retailer focus. Right. It's a great example to point out to others. Modeling it is the best way to sort of proselytize that out and encourage a whole lot more of the same. Well, and there's lots of good stories to tell.
And really to show the industry exactly the opposite of the perception you're talking about, which is, no, there are a lot of really good young retailers, and the ones that win that award every year, that's just a small sample. I mean, there's certainly, the cream of the crop, but that's just a small sample. And it's always, for guys like us that are a little bit older and have seen the industry for a while, encouraging to say, wow, there's these people that look what they're accomplishing by the time they're 35 years old.
That's a big smile on your face.
Yeah, it really does.
I think those stories are the best. Like I said, I think our industry is a great industry, and I do love family businesses. I love small, independent business in America. It's the strength of our country, and these stories are ones that exemplify everything that we admire so much in what that means. I love those stories.
Well, and one thing that I want to ask you is, one of the things that is truly such an interesting case study in retailing for the home improvement industry is the way the industry has been able, the retailers in the industry and the industry by extension has been able to evolve, because so many of those retail industries that we've seen suffer and ultimately in many ways die off did so because they couldn't evolve. It was the same business model year after year after year, and they didn't really change. How do you see independents in this industry evolving, and how do you think they need to evolve to maintain that relevancy?
I think it's an age-old question. I don't think it changes a whole lot, except the circumstances change a whole lot, right? I think it's that gift of entrepreneurial spirit, that whole, I mentioned it before, that decentralization and focus where they are the decision maker and the owner. I think they're empowered to do all that, and they do it. That ownership mentality means an awful lot. Yeah. And so when your bottom line, when your rear end even is connected to the quality of the business itself, that sense of ownership and responsibility, they take it home with them. They go to sleep with it. It wakes them up at night. That pressure, it's not always a positive thing, but that pressure creates, I think, more of an urgency around innovation, an urgency around how can I better serve my customer? They're just more responsive, and I think that's the thing that will that's the element of it that will keep them really coming back and doing it over and over again.
Well, in terms of being responsive to outside catalysts, what are some of the things, we talked a little bit about COVID, but outside of COVID, I mean, the world still turns and other things are impacting retail and impacting business. What are some of those kind of outside influencers, aside from COVID, that you see developing that are impacting the way independent retailers evolve?
Yeah, so you hit COVID, so there's the environmental factors. Let's just broadly call them external environmental factors. You could have the pandemic, you could have hurricanes, which we've had both.
Yes.
You could have massive wildfires. You could have shortages and slowdowns. You could have sudden surprises. It was just a week or two ago, maybe 2 weeks ago, suddenly ShopVac.
Right. Yeah.
Right.
Closes
Who saw that
yeah,
coming?
Right.
Right. And you've got some folks who are really reliant upon certain products in certain categories. I think we're fortunate in a way that years ago we had developed some products that gave our members choices with respect to that. So we're well positioned. But talk about a disruptive influence beyond just supply chain in general. When somebody shuts their doors, and their employees didn't even know about it until the morning they did it. That's some difficult stuff. And so I look at those factors and say, yeah, those are those are pretty critical. So those are the biggest outside forces that I look at, issues like that. But then I think you could also look at the other dynamics within the industry in general. One of the things that I think has a huge impact is not just looking at how you can service your customer, but how you can keep your business running. And so in that environment, every single one of our members is a competitor for workforce talent, right? And those
absolutely.
external forces, that's been the number one issue that our members have talked about to me over the course of the last several years, is how hard it is to find and retain key talent at every level. And that's just getting harder and harder.
Well, I think kind of leading into our next question about, are these kind of outside impacts positive, negative? I guess one thing I would say is even the one you touched on, and that is certainly one of the most common things we'll hear when we ask retailers, what are your challenges, outside of the current environment, and finding and retaining good people. But I think what you see kind of develop out of any kind of outside challenge like that, which really I think shines in the independent segment, is retailers figuring it out. Some people out there, men and women that are running these operations, say, listen, this is a challenge I'm faced with. I can't influence whether, I can maybe influence it, but ultimately I can't dictate whether minimum wage is going to go up.
Right.
I can't dictate whether a factory is going to open up the street for me and pay more, and now I have to figure out how to compete against that. I can control what goes on in my operation, and it always seems that out of those kind of challenging factors, there's someone on the independent level that says, I'll figure it out.
Yes.
And I'm not going to sit here and wait, but I'm going to set in motion things that are going to figure it out.
Yeah, not to generalize again, but I think by and large, entrepreneurs have a greater, let's just call it grit factor, right? They seem to be born and bred to confront those kind of challenges and then respond to them in a way that is productive, not woe is me.
Right.
That's not everybody and that's not every day.
Sure.
But I would say by and large, that's the difference maker, is you deal with people who are gritty in how they deal with and confront challenges. And to me, that's one of the things that I also just love about our industry. I think we got a lot of people who absolutely define that.
Well, I think it goes back a little bit to what you were saying earlier, is I think that, and I as you don't, I don't want to speak in generalities, but I think that these individuals that are running these businesses that are often family businesses, like you said, it's their legacy that they've been now put in charge with, or in charge of, or it's their, and this always is humbling for me, the people that the notes against their house,
Yes.
and so this sense of urgency to say, I've got to find a way to make it work. And what is also impressive to me is so often not that anybody that's in a management position doesn't feel this way, but that very personal connection that I so often hear from independent retailers about, I got all these jobs depending on me. I got these people whose families I know depending on me to figure out a way to make it work. And that kind of sense of urgency at that independent level is just a little bit different than I think you'd find sometimes if you're running a corporate kind of store or something like that.
I would say it's totally different.
Yeah.
The manager at your typical Menards is not thinking of things the way that our typical member is.
Right.
And I think you hit on the two key things. They've put their personal chips on the table, and they've bet on themselves, and they bet everything. Imagine the confidence that it takes and the appreciation of risk that it takes to be able to do that. And then on top of that, it's not just their personal wealth or livelihood at stake. I think they absolutely feel a sense of ownership that I have people counting on me. Right. I have employees whose lives and livelihood depend on my ability to do my job well. And they feel that not just for their employees, but for their community. I have ultimate respect for our members who do that day in and day out. And I do think that's what keeps them sharp. But make no mistake, it's a differentiator that you just can't account for any other way. Right. The manager at a big box or even someone who's an executive in charge of something like it's not the same.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Are there any other kind of, whether it's current or kind of coming down the horizon challenges that you see that are going to impact independent retailers that we maybe haven't talked about?
Challenges that they face. I mentioned earlier, Dan, I'm not trying to talk out of both sides of my mouth.
Yeah.
I did mention earlier when you were talking about where do we get a bad rap within our industry. And I was talking about, the bemoaning the lack of young folks coming into it. I mentioned there was a kernel of truth to that, and I think that other challenge is that issue of succession. Right. I do think, and I've shared this repeatedly, so I shared this with our team as part of my president's address just this last month at our virtual market, that I really do believe that we have always had that kind of issue of succession. It's, as you mentioned, it's family-owned business for the most part. So that's not new. I do think, though, that we're entering into an era where it is much, much bigger than it has been even historically. You've got a baby boom generation and a whole generation of people that have a retirement interest. And I think the number of available sellers is much bigger than the number of interested buyers in that space. Right. So I do think that that's a coming challenge, and that informs part of how we're trying to assist that. We've got to align a whole lot of programs, services, support to facilitate growth so that we can impact those buyers. We want to see growth for their sake, for our sake, for the strength of our industry. There's great businesses. You mentioned legacy. I think that's how most of our members view their business, is a legacy, and they don't want to see that diminished in any way. I think we need to do everything we can to support buyers and other members' growth to be able to keep that legacy going.
Well, and one of the things that I was going to bring up as we're thinking about challenges, because it's something that I hear all the time, which isn't probably one of the top ones that comes to mind, but it's the concept of scale, which is kind of what you're touching on. And one of the things that is a challenge for independent retailers is this concept of one thing that Home Depot would have, or Lowe's would have, or Menards would have, is scale. They have the ability to say, we're gonna mine a bunch of other resources to make a shift in operations, or we can roll something out and make it happen, or we have this scale that is beyond what someone running 2 or 3 stores in Kansas might be, and that's just something that's kind of inherent to independent retailers. Now, when I write my second book about the independent retailer, wow, I'm just making plans for retirement.
So ambitious, yeah.
But I really want to focus on, because I think one of the things that is obviously different about our industry that some of these other industries that failed didn't have is the distributors that provide some of that scale and say, you might not be able to harness some economic outlook or have a marketing department, but we can provide those functions. It was those kind of that Do It Best, and other distributors obviously fulfill those roles. But even with that, how do we help independent retailers get greater scale to do things like grow, or to do things like harness services that don't force them to be on an island and try and do everything, reinvent the wheel every time they want to do something.
Right, right. And I think you're absolutely right in pointing to, hey, that's where we can come in and add value.
Right.
We have both a resource and the ability to spread that across a broader set of potential supporters of that program to make it cost effective in the grand scheme.
Right.
That's a pretty straightforward formula, right? And we can do that. And let's point to a few things specifically. This is not a commercial for Do It Best, but I'll point to a couple things that I think illustrate that very well. Do you need a team of buyers, or should you leverage what the co-op can provide you there, and then concentrate on the selling side of your business? And that's nothing against. I think we do need some members who have
buying teams.
They need a buying team. But I'm talking about really the breadth of what it would truly take to replicate the scale that you're talking about. You can leverage a lot that exists within your co-op from that standpoint. The resources available for growth. So part of that is, there are banking relationships, but there are also things unique to the co-op where our members can tap into their preference stock and really at a much lower cost of capital facilitate growth through acquisition by getting that access to their shares and then using it for either a store expansion or a brand new store or an acquisition of an existing store elsewhere. Those are opportunities that are definitely available to them. A couple others. I look at the prevalence of data. There's great information that our members have about their customers. No doubt about it. They are the experts within their communities. However, I will also say they just don't have the ability to collect huge swaths of data of let's say, similarly organized retail profile. Let's just say that they're a home center. What's the top sellers within these categories? They might know what's coming through their cash register. How can they bounce that against a broader data set?
What are they missing?
What are they missing? How do you have a complete set? How do you optimize it? How do you continue to maintain it? Those are areas where we can absolutely add value. Last one I'll mention is just on the marketing side. I think our members have responded really, really strongly to the idea of managed marketing services. Can they delegate out to us? Again, they might have a staff person inside, they might not, depending on their size. But even if they have someone, how much can they allow us to do? And whether it's the print, the digital, the social, the loyalty, the data mining through it, the store design elements, that these are things that they're willing to pay for us to manage all of their marketing, and we've got a lot of members that are signing up for exactly that. Those are scale issues where I think we have the great ability to add value to our members. And as with any other business, take a problem off their plate. Sure. You solve a problem, you've just invented a business. Right. So that to me is the key that we need to continue to provide to our members. That value proposition exists. We can allow them to get to scale. We can also, for a total delivered cost, make it very cost effective.
Yeah. And I know that, and I wanted to, as we're kind of closing out here, give certainly thanks to organizations like Do It Best that support NHPA, because one of our missions is to be able to be an organization that helps provide that scale with things like our cost of doing business study, our retail management certification program, the education and training we provide that is only possible with support of folks like yourself and members of the vendor community who really step up because they have a vested interest in making sure independents are here for a long time. So let me kind of close with this question to you, because we are at the All Industry Conference here, and we're talking to an audience that includes retailers, manufacturers, industry watchers, other distributors. What can the industry do to kind of come together to support independent retailers?
It's hard to get the entire industry to swim in the same direction at the same time.
Yeah, so I've noticed.
That's a tough ask, but there may be some things that we can do. I look at the complexity of products. So I'll speak to the distributor, vendor side of things. When it comes to, this is going to get awfully policy oriented. I apologize, but Dan, I look at it and I go, we could solve a lot of problems if we could have some standardization in how we deal with product descriptions, product attributes, systems. Boy, could we help each other out by being a little bit consistent so that we're not all inventing the same thing. That's on the distributor side, that's on the vendor side, it's
yeah.
all across. What could we do though to help the member? That's something that's not all that critical. It is critical, but it's more in the preparation for those of us on the offering side. At the member level, there's a lot that we could do to better enable them, and frankly, some of that goes to, I'll just say it on the product side. I think as we work with our vendors, the ability to find and provide unique product offerings, exclusive product offerings, even if they're not exclusive, somewhat of a planned feature set, smooth out disruptions. I mentioned shop-vac. Maybe there was no way.
Right.
Maybe there was no way for us to avoid that kind of issue. Maybe. But I look at that and I think in terms of cooperation in making sure that supply chain works and works well for everybody, there are ways that we could more effectively communicate so that we're serving the entire industry as best we can. And I'll speak directly to folks within the independent. How about that? I'll narrow it down a little bit. I think that there's a lot that we could do across others that we might consider competitors, but frankly, we're all supporting independents. And I think of that group as a fraternity more than I do a competitor set. We kind of compete, but I'd rather see a robust support for all independents and us cooperate to be able to do that effectively.
Yeah.
That's my commercial plug for us to work better together.
Well, and I would have to say that I think that where we started was talking about the pandemic, and I would say that I think as this pandemic started, the effort that where we saw all the different heads of the distribution organizations within North America come together to make sure that hardware home improvement was considered essential. To me, that was a pivot point. And I really hope from our standpoint at NHPA that kind of sentiment of, listen, we may have different programs and we may represent ourselves in different ways, but we're, as you just said, we're here to serve the independent, and it's in all of our best interests that no matter what flag they're currently flying, because sometimes people switch between distributors occasionally.
I've heard that.
But it's in all of our best interest that they remain lively and that they remain progressive in what they do.
Exactly right.
Dan, is there anything else you wanted to cover today? We've covered a lot of ground.
We have covered a lot of ground, Dan. Let's save all that dry powder for our next podcast.
All right, for next month. How's that?
Next month,
all
we'll
right.
get together and do it again.
Well, thank you so much, Dan, for taking time once again to sit down and talk with us and share your thoughts on the industry. And thanks to everybody in the audience. And we hope you enjoy and engage in some of the other educational content that we're offering through the NHPA All Industry Conference / NRHA All Industry Conference. And we hope you take advantage of your time here at the National Hardware Show virtual edition to kind of take a look around and see what's out there and really start thinking about what are those products, what are those programs, what are those services that are going to help you be the next disruptor in your marketplace. Thank you so much.